Thanks for tuning in to Life with God. I'm Adelina, and today we're exploring freedom with our special guest, Jerome Skinner, Associate Professor of Old Testament Exegesis and Theology, and Director of the Institute of Jewish Christian Studies at the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary in Berry Springs, Michigan. Before we dive into the conversation, let's start by getting to know our guest. What is something that always makes you smile?
My family, just being with my family. Uh, my uncle has a laugh that makes you laugh. So every time I'm around my family, my immediate family and my extended family, it's always a smiling experience.
What is a talent that you have never expressed to anyone?
That I've never expressed to anyone.
Like a hidden talent.
I really don't. A hidden talent, I don't know. I sing, but I don't often sing in public anymore.
Ah,
So I guess that's a hidden talent.
What are some of your favorite family activities?
Family activities. I like to go to the beach with my family. We do that as much as we can. And family picnics, that's always a good thing. So just spending time out in nature with my family.
If you were something in nature, what would you be?
A hawk or an eagle.
And why?
Their perspective, the height that they get to their perspective is a lot more broader. So I like that about eagles, is that their eyesight can penetrate to something small, but their purview is generally vast and broader than just being on the ground.
speaking of perspective, what is the wisest thing someone ever said to you?
Wherever you go, there you are.
Okay, where do you go for inspiration?
To the beach. I often just go and I'll just sit at the beach and just listen to the waves, um, and the view. That's where I catch inspiration.
How did God come through to you at your lowest?
Um, just in a sense of comfort. It wasn't anything auditory or another person, but just a sense of comforting presence. Probably when I was at my lowest point.
What would you say was the most influential point in your life?
Towards me, or my life towards someone else?
Speaking directly towards you.
Sure. I have a mentor. His name is James Clark. He took me in kind of like a son, and I needed that at that point in my life. Having grown up in a single parent household, him being there for me, and to this day, he still sees me as like a son. He really mentored me and encouraged me, and took me in a way that was inspiring, and to this day, leaves a great imprint on who I am, how I think, and what I do.
What is the most adventurous thing you have done?
I got lost on Mount Sinai, and God helped me down, and I saw some amazing things that most people don't get to see, because the place where I got lost, you can't really walk. There's not a space to really walk. So it was interesting, going through that whole experience, where Elijah was, where Moses was, and being able to see um, things that the Bible talks about. And it was an amazing experience.
If you could choose between playing every instrument and speaking every language, which one would you choose?
Speaking every language.
And why?
Just being able to communicate with everyone. Um, I would love to do that. I'm actually striving to do that now. I'm at 10, and if I can add more, then I will. But with 2 children, it makes it a little bit more difficult.
You mean you know 10 languages?
Yes.
Which ones are those? That's quite impressive.
So some of them are spoken languages,
Yeah.
modern Hebrew, French, German, and then some of them are what we call dead languages, Ugaritic, Greek, Hellenistic, and Koine, even though I don't necessarily make that distinction. Egyptian, I'm learning, Akkadian, what else? Aramaic. I'm trying to remember them all now. Um, Syriac or Ethiopic is on the list, and I'm also learning Latin. So I'm trying. It's
Okay.
interesting trying to keep those in your head, but I try.
Yeah, that's especially because they're quite different. So
Yeah.
are these useful for you in any particular project, or is just exposure to different ways of thinking through understanding the language?
Both. Um, in my field, I think, having a breadth of knowledge from different perspectives engages you with different mindsets and different ways of thinking. But then just on a personal level, I like to read literature, and hearing it in its original language is probably um, more satisfying for me, I guess. You can read it in the English translation, but you lose something. So
Wow, that's quite impressive. Especially juggling that with a full-time job and family responsibility. So you must have a gift for it. Maybe that's one of your gifts, but maybe it's not hidden. So good to know that. Yeah, today we talk about freedom, which, as we've discussed before, it is a concept that is quite complex. We are looking at it from an Old Testament perspective, from a biblical perspective. And we'll delve into that in a moment. Before that, I would like to ask Shiva and Marie if they can share, in regard to the topic of freedom, what are some of the factors that have shaped your view of freedom as you were a child growing up? Since that is a very formative time of our lives, and then maybe has there been a time after that, a moment or an experience that has shifted a bit your perspective on freedom?
So for me, growing up, freedom always looked like protection, which is very unique. So I always looked at freedom in regards to protection, but safety, with the parents being that safe shield for me, that I can express myself, I can play, I can feel safe, I can feel comfortable. And yet there was always still that those regulations that were in place. So freedom had protection, had safety, but it also had boundaries and rules for me. And of course, as a child, when you get older, for me that changed a little bit, because now freedom, I would say, as an adult, was being more defined by me now, as an individual, and as a Christian, as a believer. Um, Coming from living in a secular world, I had freedom without bounds, without limits, without regulations, I would say. And then becoming a Christian, um, it was a struggle of trying to understand this new freedom in Christ. And for now, for me, freedom looks like kind of more peaceful. For me, it looks like I'm able to express myself. I'm able to live in grace, but I also still have this freedom that also guides me of I still have responsibilities and a morality, a way that I'm supposed to live according to the word of God.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, for me, while growing up, I was very happy with the freedom that my parents gave, maybe because I was not such a strong-willed or a free-spirited child, so I was quite happy with being in, in the safe protection of my family. But I think one thing that my parents did different, that is different in our culture, is that they allowed us to make choices of our own and also listen to God's voice, which is most unlike in our culture because there the family and the extended family have a say in what you do in the future, like what you study, which career path you choose, and who you get married. And my parents allowed us to do that. And I think I really respect them for that. And because of that, I had to make hard decisions of my own, although I would have liked for them to indicate what I could do. And sometimes choosing your career at that age is it's not an easy decision. And I have to live with whatever I chose. And um so I think I'm happy about what they've done for me because that gave me the confidence to choose and to, also to live out the consequences of it. And I think that's the same I would do for my family.
Awesome, thank you. It's quite interesting because both of you shared something that I resonate with as well, in the way that my parents raised me and my sister, and that they offered us unconditional love that was exemplified in many different ways, small and big, including allowing us to make decisions. And so I also experienced a sense of freedom in terms of safety of a space and unconditional love and yes, responsibility, freedom to make decisions and the responsibility that comes with that. And that was a really good combination for me growing up. I think it has shaped me for the rest of my life. So I've never really changed my view of freedom in that sense. Um, except, yes, the fall of communism has been a very significant experience for me. I probably will have been talking about this in different episodes as well. Politically, just experiencing that change of regime was very significant. Um, as Christians, we believe that we're created in the image of God. Not only that we're created, that all humans are created in the image of God. And that image of God includes a sense of freedom. But this biblical view of freedom, as we had some conversation earlier in the group here, this sense of freedom that the Bible gives us is a bit different, or maybe radically different, we'll see today, than what some of the prevalent understandings of freedom have been, especially in the Western society. Modernism, maybe starting with modernism, especially Enlightenment, and then further towards the postmodern time in which we live. So, Jerome, could you open up the conversation with some thoughts on this difference between how you understand the secular way of of viewing freedom from maybe a philosophical point of view, a cultural, we could say societal point of view, and then how you have seen the Bible correct that, if we want to say, or reframe that view of freedom?
Sure. So I would say the biggest difference, and I think you hit the nail on the head when you use the word worldview.
Mhm.
There were no atheists in the ancient world, right? That's what we call it, the ancient Near East. Everyone had some concept of a deity, and everyone had some concept at some level that you did not have what modernists would call radical autonomy, that you're just operating as a standstill individual, that you control your destiny. You know, we heard the language today of manifesting your future. And when I listen to these concepts, just even from an anthropological perspective, I say that's impossible, right? It's impossible that I, as a standalone entity, can operate in a way where I have radical autonomy without consequence. And I think that's the biggest distinction between the world that we live in today and the concepts that people have about freedom and in the ancient world. They understood there's concepts for your actions, whereas today I don't know if it always comes to mind that, yeah, you're free to do whatever you want, but there's consequences with it. And I think what ends up happening is once people experience those consequences in our world today, it's kind of like, but wait a minute, right? Why am I experiencing the consequences? And I think when we talk about freedom, we have to talk about the reality, as Marie said, about, having those boundaries, right? We have laws today. For instance, you are free to yell fire in a crowded theater, but the consequences, you can be charged with a crime for doing that because you put other people's life at risk. So I think when we're talking about this concept of freedom, the biggest distinction is um, consequences are not focused on so much in our modern society, whereas in the ancient Near East, given their concept of deity, their concept of how the world operated, you just couldn't live in a world where you would think you had this radical autonomy.
That's very interesting. I'm not going to delve into this much at all at this point, but I will just mention briefly that my research is on uh, hermeneutics and what I call meta hermeneutics, which is a framework of reality from which we interpret everything, including the Bible. And the kind of reality that I propose in my model is one where God is the first reality. He defines reality. And the kind of reality that I arrive at from this premise of God as the first reality is one of interdependence, not independence. So it actually goes against the grain of not only Greek philosophy, but modernism, which I see as a reflection of Greek timeless thinking as well, just in different ways, more focused on anthropology, as you shared already. So this all goes back to the view of the world is independent as opposed to interdependent. And then how do we function in that world? So just as a side comment here, because it resonates a lot with what I'm just the entire worldview. How do you think about reality and the world? Is it independent or is it interdependent? Now, as a follow-up question, you mentioned that in ancient Near East, especially, or in ancient times, people had a concept of they were not atheists, they had a concept of a deity and a sort of relation to that deity, even if it wasn't personal, maybe. What about the role of community? Because when I think interdependence, I also think community. How was that different then? How was that different in the biblical time of the Old Testament as opposed to where we live today? And how does that shape our concept of freedom from the Bible also?
Sure. I want to talk about this in the context of love, right? I think a lot of people don't associate love with what we call the Old Testament. I think for various reasons, but um, the people had just come out of slavery, right? And that's where we actually enter into the Bible. You have people that have just come out of slavery, and so they need to go back and hear the narrative, the story, the history about their origins and how they got to Egypt and how they were enslaved, and then now God's bringing them out. And one of the things that God actually tells them is, you shall love your neighbor who is like yourself. And so the framework that we have of laws, right? It's different than the way we think about laws today, but that is the freedom. You're freed from bondage. Now you're free to love. And so community factors into this notion of freedom, is that there is to be now no hindrance on your ability to interact with someone else who has the image of God, because that's how the Bible begins, by helping these newly freed, enslaved people who are enslaved, to understand that you are created in the image of God, just like everyone else. And so now your freedom is not restricted. You are free to love one another. You are free to be just. You are free to be fair. You are free to raise your children to love the Lord their God with all their heart, mind, and soul. There's this openness now. And I just want to go back to what Marie said, that there's safety. There's safety in that freedom because you know what to expect from your neighbor, right? You know what you should expect in your environment. You know what to expect for the future. So yes, there's boundaries because again, this interdependence, but there's this biblical freedom, which I would call radical freedom, because you're not living in this kind of miasma of, well, what's going to happen? How? No, you know what to expect, and you know what to do if things don't go according to that expectation. God told the Israelites, if you do wrong to your neighbor, they can call out to me. So if there's an imposition or a restriction on your freedom, there's something in place there that the people would know about to help them restore that notion of communal freedom.
Very interesting. Just a quick follow-up. If I'm hearing you correctly, then there are some psychological overtones as well when you said something like, if I'm understanding you well, that when God's image is restored in us, then that enables us a certain kind of freedom or a deeper level of freedom to love others, to see others in the image of God and to love others. So that's very deep because it shows that true freedom begins with self-work, so to speak, work on yourself in your understanding of who you are in relation to God.
Right. Most people in history have reverted to force because of that very issue. When there's a sense of um that you are not going to get the response of love, when other people are selfish like you are, it's like, well, how do I negotiate getting what I want? That's where force comes in, right? One of the most ironic, I specialize in Enlightenment philosophy, and one of the most ironic historical realities that I have observed is how the French Enlightenment spoke so much about freedom, but you had the guillotine, in the back of your head. And the man who started this notion, Maximilien Robespierre, he ended up getting killed on the guillotine, right? He was the foremost advocate for this notion of radical autonomy, but at the end of the day, because there is no real freedom in radical autonomy, he ended up getting killed by the very thing that he used, right, to try to control other people. So there's this a psychological issue not only for Christians but also for people that don't subscribe to the biblical worldview. How do you get other people to act in a certain way? And unfortunately, in our world, force is what people resort to.
I think that that's a really good point that you brought out, Adelina, about the internal aspect or the psychological aspect. So my question would be, is when it comes to this concept of freedom in Christ, and I know we're kind of mentioning or making distinction of that, the big question that's going on around is like, well, my freedom looks different outside of Christ. Can you make a distinction about what is the freedom that usually secular, non-religious would say that they're living as a good person versus what is this actual freedom in Christ? How do we make that distinction? Because some people are like, well, do I even need Jesus if I can live as a good person? How can you make that distinction of, is that true freedom outside of Christ?
So forgive me for the word that I'm about to use, but just for our viewing audience. So most people fall into something called a solipsism, where reality only exists in their head. Now, most people would say, of course, I don't believe that. I can see the person next to me, but I'm talking about conceptually. So we as people of faith, people who take the Bible seriously believe that there is a being called Satan, right? That there's a fallen angel, and there are other fallen angels who are under his control, and that they are involved in trying to deceive, manipulate. You know, Jesus said the enemy has come to steal, kill, and destroy. And so, from a biblical perspective, we understand that we are not just operating as radical autonomous, that there are entities outside. And then, from a Christian perspective, the image of God has been um, affected and infected by sin. So, there's also the enemy inside. You know, Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 7. You know, he said, I know we're dealing with the Old Testament, but Paul's an Old Testament theologian, so I'll go with him. He said, when I want to do good, there's evil inside of me. So he acknowledges that there's a problem inside of us, and there's a problem external to us. So when most people who do not subscribe to the Bible talk about freedom, I, as a Christian, believe conceptually that they are falling into that trap of solipsism. They think, well, because I don't believe that there's a devil, because I don't believe that I have a fallen nature, then reality must operate according to how I think. The only problem with that is, imagine if 8 billion people think like that. You're going to have chaos, right? You're going to have different people coming to different conclusions about reality and saying, well, my truth is the truth, right? Like this concept that all truths are equal is problematic, because we can't. What if my truth says that I'm able to do certain things, and your truth says that I'm not able to do certain things? Then I can accuse you of impinging on my freedom, and you can accuse me of impinging on you. And so you see, you just fall into this chaotic state. Whereas with the biblical notion of freedom, again, we come back to this notion of, yes, you're free to choose, but you do have to deal with the consequences of those choices. And the beautiful thing about the biblical notion of freedom, in one passage I'll bring to your attention, in Psalm 119, verse 45, the New International Version translates it this way. He says, I walk about in freedom, for I have sought out your precepts. Now, this word freedom, it translates from the word a broad place, right? So there's this breadth to what God allows, right? But that's in harmony with what he advocates in terms of how we live, how we interact, how we think. Whereas again, you know, I kind of laugh when people say, well, have an open mind. I say, well, what does that look like, right? What does an open mind look like in terms of freedom? You have the world that we have today, right? Where there's disagreements. And then again, we come back to this problem of force, right? When people disagree, who can they appeal to? If you don't have a biblical concept of reality, you can't appeal. What if the government is the problem? Well, you can't appeal to the government. So then I, as this radical autonomous being, I have to advocate to force, to get other people to do what I want. So again, when we talk about freedom, we're dealing with this issue of what are the consequences, and then how do we deal with the fact that other people may think about something differently than we do.
I understand that sin has distorted our view of freedom. But let me play the devil's advocate. Just like in the beginning of the world's history, it started with something maybe not so significant, like Eve's curiosity, her want to explore something beyond what was, placed before her, what maybe explore something of the unknown, something as maybe that might not seem as significant as, being a radical, trying to find your autonomy, but just something as insignificant as curiosity. How would you define that in terms of freedom?
Sure. So you didn't know that you're going to learn Hebrew today, but you are. I'll keep it very simple. So the first command, if you will, I don't really like that word, but it's a way to get at the point that I'm trying to make, that God gives to humanity is in Genesis 2:15. He says, eating you may eat. So in Hebrew, it's the strongest way that you can affirm something. So in Genesis 2:15, God says, eating you may eat. 2:16, sorry. And some translations say, you may surely eat of every tree of the garden. So think about this. Every tree, verse 17, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. So think about that, right? Most people would say, well, God is restricting my freedom. And I say, no, this story of how we got into trouble started because God gave this freedom for every tree. And then he just said there's just one that he doesn't want people to eat from. And that curiosity, which may seem um, insignificant to us, this notion of curiosity, um, that was actually the beginning of the problem, that God gives this breadth, right? What the psalmist was talking about, this freedom, this broad place to move and to live in. And it's just that one thing he said, don't do. He said, I want to have radical autonomy to be able to eat from this tree without dealing with the consequences. Because if you notice, when God comes to Adam and Eve, what do? They start pointing at each other. Adam says, the woman you gave me, he's blaming God. The woman says, the serpent you made, she's blaming God. And then the serpent's looking around like, man, I got to get out of here, right? So again, there's this notion where we tend to see what God is um, saying to us as restrictive, where really he gives us this broad place to live in, where there's love, there's peace, there's joy, there's equity. What we tend to see is when humans in the modern world and in the ancient world after sin, when we talk about these aspects of love, and no, it always turns into force, having to enforce these things because it's not natural or native to who we are as humans now after the fall, to really express that broad place, right? So God says, every tree, don't eat just one. Like we're trying to restrict what humans do. And we were talking a little bit earlier about artificial intelligence. And this is really going to change the game in terms of freedom, because AI, it's at a point now, and who knows where it's going to go, where the computer is almost trying to outthink you, right? If you notice something simple, nebulous, you're typing on your computer right now, your digital platform, whatever you're using, whether it's Pages or Word, will suggest the rest of your sentence to you, right? So it's a computer trying to outthink you. Well, where's your freedom to be able to think for yourself, right? So again, when we think about freedom, we think about, oh, well, God is restricting my freedom, but why don't we ever, use that same sentiment to how technology operates, right? People don't tend to think about technology as being a restriction. We think about it as opening up new vistas of freedom. Well, people who, you know, interact and interface with artificial intelligence are concerned, because they're concerned we're going to create something that can outthink us. And then I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but then you have something like iRobot, right? Where what you've created is like, well, I don't want to do what you said. I'm going to do what I see as the best expression. And so we're actually dealing with this concept of freedom on many levels.
Going back now, this may be philosophical, but it sounds like from the Garden of Eden, what the example you're giving from scripture about how Eve was tempted. And so there can be a question that is posed, well, how much of our free will is easily influenced? Because some people may look at that and be like, well, since we were created in the image of God, why was she so able to be tempted like that? So it makes us question the concept of freedom in the beginning in regards to, well, we're just going to be susceptible to, I guess, negative influences. So then people are like, well, then how is that freedom if everyone can just be easily influenced in that way? Because if God created us with freedom, but he's given us his commandments, he's given us his statutes, some people will be like, well, then freedom is kind of an illusion. Therefore, then we can just have this autonomy aspect to it. So does freedom actually look like boundaries, or is the freedom an aspect that is developed over time through the development of the person's character? If that kind of makes sense, I'm trying to bridge things.
Sure, it makes great sense. So I'm married. When our vows we're repeating our vows, imagine if they said, do you promise to be faithful to your wife, to love, to protect? Imagine if I said, how dare you? That's an imposition of my freedom. I'll decide how I'm going to love my wife. And it doesn't include anything that you just said. Like, my wife would have looked at, I don't even know if she would have been my wife today if I said that, but she would have looked at me funny, and probably everyone in the audience would have been like, wait, what? Why did you say that? Right? So true love demands a risk. And I think my colleague John Peckham, in his book A Theodicy of Love, hit the nail on the head when he talks about this, that God's love is it's a risk. He allows this freedom to choose to love him back, and this freedom to choose not to love him back. And I think it's unsettling, because sometimes we want God to treat us like robots, and then sometimes you want God to just let us alone. So what do I mean by that? So a lot of people question the justice of God when it comes to this issue of Israel's engagement with the Canaanites or other groups of people, especially when they were just freed from Egypt and they were going into the land of Canaan. And so it's at that point people want God to kind of be this advocate for radical autonomy. The problem is that it's not like the Canaanites were sitting there like, come, Israel, come and be our neighbors and let's have fun, right? No, they weren't doing that. You live in a warfare society where there's rules of engagement on how you interact with the people groups that you're going to be living around. And so God has to give these boundaries for Israel to understand what love looks like. Because if he just left it up to the people to respond however they want, we see what happened when he gave them rules. They broke them, and then when he said, no one's done what you've done. But imagine if he didn't give those boundaries, it could even be worse. So there's this risk where you give your creation the freedom to choose when there's the possibility that they're going to turn around and do what we did to Christ on the cross, right? We'll turn around and kill the very one who came to give us freedom. We'll turn around, and what did they tell God? They said, it was better when we were in Egypt. Well, how? They were slaves. They didn't have freedom. And it just goes to show you how our thinking, when we want God to, force us to be robots, if he doesn't do it, if he forced all the Canaanites and all the Egyptians to be nice people, well, then we would accuse him of being unfair and not giving freedom. But then when he does give freedom and the Canaanites and Egyptians are allowed to do whatever they want because love takes that risk, then we're like, well, God, you're unfair. So actually God is in this place where he can't win, right? In our modern sense of freedom, because we expect him to do things that sometimes restrict other people's freedom, but then gives us freedom. So it's kind of this catch-22 problem, right? Do we want God to give us this radical freedom, or do we want him to control us so that we don't we don't get deceived, or so that we don't deceive other people. So there's a risk with love. And I think every person who gets married, every person who has children, they understand that you can do your best to raise your children, and your children can look in your face and say, get lost, right? But love demands that risk that people take, and God took that risk with humanity as well.
I wonder if you could go a bit more into the concept of boundaries and freedom. Because as I hear the conversation, this thing is going through my mind that freedom is both powerful because ultimately we can make choices because we have freedom, but it's also so fragile. It feels so fragile and so vulnerable. Because one, our choices have consequences, and two, other people also have freedom to make choices that can hurt us. So freedom is shared, is not an independent thing. We share freedom with others, with the community, and it's both powerful and fragile. And so even this concept of limited freedom is going back to something you mentioned earlier, that true freedom, I think the way I understand it, true freedom needs limitations because, for example, when you have to make a choice, you have to have a limited number of options to actually be able to make a choice. So freedom really works at the interdependence of what I call categories of existence, where there are boundaries, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense. You cannot choose from an infinite number of options, at least not in the embodied way in which we live now, and probably also in eternity. So God has created us in a sense fragile, and that goes against this robotic concept of a being that God didn't want to create us with, and that humans seem to want to lead to move towards, to transcend our fragility, so to speak. So what are some of your thoughts about boundaries? What can we learn from the Old Testament about what kind of boundaries does God give us to enable freedom, true freedom?
Sure. So I often ask myself and my students a simple question. How does your garden grow? Okay. You know, anyone who has a green thumb, as they call it, I don't. My plants have died because of a simple problem. I did not nurture them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what boundaries does is it gives us, and by the way, all the commandments are not negative. I think when people think about commands in our modern context, they see it as a restriction from you doing whatever you want. But actually, many of the commands that God gives actually is advocating for you to be a certain kind of person. So for instance, when it comes to widows and orphans, there's a restriction put on the well-to-do person who doesn't have any lack or any need, and then God says, well, use the freedom that you have to be a blessing. So in Leviticus 19 and other places, he tells them, leave the edges of the field for those that are poor to be able to come and have some sustenance. So it's, on the one hand, it's a restriction, if you want to look at it like that, from the wealthy person just hoarding everything. It's actually teaching them and giving them the habit of being selfless, right? It's helping that garden grow. It's nurturing altruism, right? Thinking about the other. And so you have these commands in the Bible, not necessarily as restrictions, but as ways to help nurture uh, a certain kind of notion of humanity. What does it mean to be in the image of God? Another example where it talks about caring for um, your animals. Like again, we some people would just think, well, animals are just there to be used for human labor or for our food, but God tells them in several places to take care of your animals, right? To take care of your environment, to take care of the creation. So a lot of these we would see as restrictions are actually ways to open up what it means to be human. In Deuteronomy 15, God tells them two things. One, remember that you were once a slave. So there's a moral impetus for you to act in ways that don't restrict other people. So that's point one. And then in another place in that chapter, he says, remember that this is your brother. See them as your brother, see them as your kin, even if they're not, biologically related to you. See them as someone who has value. And so these boundaries are really ways that God gives for us to develop a certain type of character that will reflect God's character. In Leviticus 19, God says, be holy as I am holy. And then you know what follows? He talks to them about how to treat other people to maintain their dignity. Now imagine a society where we're all acting in ways to maintain each other's dignity. That's going to allow, again, for this robust notion of freedom. There's nobody trying to restrict your movements. There's no one trying to restrict your development as a human. But again, because human nature, God has to put these guardrails on to say, well, if you go beyond that, if you do something that's inconsistent with God's character, there are consequences. And I think the consequences can also be redemptive, because it's reminding us that we're not these autonomous beings who can do whatever we want without consequences. Yes, I am called to be a reflector of God's image. And if I choose, I have the freedom to choose. If I choose not to do that, I just can't go on living my life and say, well, I'll do what I want. No, there's a calling to accounts, as it were, for how we dismantle another person's dignity.
I think that's so powerful to have that distinction, because like Adelina was saying, like sometimes we can think freedom has all these unlimited amounts of options and choices, but if we're not presented with options and also with consequences, what is it called, like The Purge? There's like this movie that has come out where there's a day that you're given to do whatever you want to do. There's no laws. And people are literally doing evil. They're murdering people, they're stealing, they're robbing. And so it looks like freedom also does include boundaries, but as you mentioned in the Old Testament, these are all things, the threat through it seems like it's all things to actually do good to one another, and not just to one another, but also God's creation. So that helps to bring some balance and perspective, that freedom is not restrictive. And also the point you mentioned about the artificial intelligence, as well as Adelina, like I think within Christianity, we do desire, because of the frailty of not wanting to sin and not wanting to make mistakes, sometimes we do want God just to basically download his USB card into the back of our heads or something and, make us to act a certain way. But man, that's the scary part about freedom. It's like there's that risk, as you mentioned. So it helps me to have some more perspective about God's love towards us and also my freedom as well.
Obedience and surrender doesn't sound like something we would associate with freedom, but according to the Bible, it is very much related. So how would you explain or portray these concepts to a person who doesn't have a biblical worldview?
Sure. So I want to deal with this word obedience. So in the history of thought, right? Immanuel Kant had this notion called deontological ethics. In other words, he's saying that you should be ethical as a duty. It's something you should say, this is my duty and I have to do it. Well, the Bible doesn't advocate duty-based obedience. It advocates a response of love to two things. One, who God is, and then two, what God is doing in the world, right? So you're responding to who God is. Well, what does the Bible say? God is love. So my loyalty is predicated on this loving being who wants to be in relationship with me? Not only that, what is this loving being doing in the world? If he's restoring and he's trying to bring um, creation to restoration, then my response is that I want to be in relationship with God, and I want to be in relationship with what he's doing in the world. So when people talk about obedience, they think of it in terms of AI. Like God is just trying to dictate my every move. I'll give you one example, the Sabbath. There is no commandment on what to do on the Sabbath. I don't know if you've ever recognized that. Isaiah 58 is the only place where it says what to do. And that's the chapter on loosing bonds, right? That's a chapter on giving freedom to the person who is yoked. So the Sabbath is really a day of freedom. It's a day. No, I'm not saying we should just go do anything, but I'm saying the concept that the Sabbath is a day of restoration, renewal, refreshment, all the words that are associated with it in Genesis and Exodus and Ezekiel and Isaiah. So there's this notion of the response of love to love. So if you think of it like Kant, and you're thinking of it, I have to do this duty or I'm going to get in trouble, right? By the first century, that's the way some, not all, that's the way some of the rabbis had come to start thinking, that you have to do this so we don't go into exile again. Well, that's not fun, right? Your life can become so meticulous that you stop living life, right? You start thinking, okay, I can only I can only walk this far in the Sabbath. Okay, I can only, but in some circles today, like people can't even turn lights on or make their stove operate because this notion of restriction where God says, no, honor the Sabbath. And then you ask, well, how? Well, then that demands a relationship. So it's not just a rule, just do this apart from and distinct from relationship. It's you're doing these things as a response to a person. You're doing these things in response to what someone is doing. So if I could use the analogy again of marriage, typically, if a husband or wife buys flowers or does a nice gesture for their spouse, the spouse usually won't frown. They're not going to be like, why did you do this? Right? In a healthy relationship, usually they won't do that. They'll usually respond, right, with gratitude. They usually will respond with a thank you. They'll usually respond in some way that acknowledges you were selfless and thinking about me and you did something for my benefit that you didn't have to do. So I'm going to respond to that gesture. And that's just something simple like flowers. But again, it's that reciprocal relationship that if you're doing something selflessly for me, then my response should be something in return. And instead of looking at it just transactionally, if we look at it relationally, I think our notion of obedience can be something healthy rather than just a duty.
Thank you so much, Jerome, for sharing some biblical perspectives. We have a few minutes left of the conversation, and we did cover quite a few angles, quite a few ideas here. So I'm curious for the takeaways, what particular aspects stood out to you, Marie and Bathsheba?
For me, like I was saying earlier too, just the vastness of freedom. That is really helping to open up my perspective because I do see, I haven't really explored all the different, I guess, denominations within Christianity, but I can only speak in regards to Seventh-day Adventism, which I am. And I think that there's some areas of growth when it comes to understanding God's freedom, especially when it comes to the Sabbath. As kids, it's like, no, you're not allowed to play. As a kid, it's like, no, you're not allowed to run. You're not allowed to do these things. And so it really has been affecting the way that people experience and enjoy and have relation with God. And so this episode, I really, really, really am going to share it with as many people as I know, because there are some good insights here to understand the vastness of it And we're not saying that freedom is without bounds, but freedom is actually enjoyable with the bounds.
I think something that I like about this episode is that how you explained freedom in light of the New Testament and the Old Testament. Actually, you brought the concept of love and how we express our freedom with one another and towards God in the concept in the sphere of love. So that's something that will shape my worldview of freedom. Also, in this conversation, I'm beginning to realize how different people relate to freedom and how we can respond to it. So yes, I think that's something that I will take away from this episode.
My takeaway will probably be short this time, because I feel like I can state it, I can articulate it, but I have to reflect much more on it. But I'm left with a sense that I need to learn to appreciate more the fragility of freedom. I feel more comfortable with the power aspect of freedom. Maybe it's my life experience with the concept of freedom, but I maybe don't have as much life experience with the fragility of freedom. So I'm kind of challenged to understand it better and to experience it more, whatever that means. I have no idea what it means. But that's kind of my overall sense from the conversation. All the different angles that you've shared are very helpful and very cohesive, I think, in reframing our thinking from a biblical point of view. We really appreciate that. And yes, do you have any closing thoughts on the topic, especially after the conversation?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, thank you for allowing me to be a part of the conversation. I would say on my journey, biblically, philosophically, I've come across this notion of existence, right? And in the 1900s, you have these philosophers, especially French philosophers, where they talk about this notion. It's a philosophy called existentialism, right? What does it mean to exist? What does it mean to be human? There's actually a Christian existentialist, a famous one. But I don't think we wrestle with this issue of what does it mean to be human, right? Why did God create us? To what end? To what purpose? And what does redemption look like as its end goal, its in between, situation? I think the danger is that Christians look at salvation kind of static, in a static way, like Christ saved me from my sins. Yes, that's amazing, that's awesome, but to what end? Right? To what purpose? What now should your life look like? And so Jesus, the ultimate Old Testament theologian, talked about this process of growth, right? He said a sower went to sow, and that he spread his seed. And if you're familiar with the story, you know it. If you don't, just read Mark 4 or Matthew 13. But he talks about this cultivating process where some yielded this much, some yielded another amount. Again, it's this notion of growth and development. And so I don't see freedom restrictively or as an imposition. I see freedom as the ability to grow in what it means to be created in the image of God. And I understand the risk. I understand, Marie, the comfort of having God tell you what to do at every second of the day. But I think that can have psychological effects, right? Where you're not thinking about freedom anymore. You're thinking about control and power. But God wants the response of love because he gives love. And so for me, that has been the most freeing thought, that love takes a risk. And I'm willing to take that risk with him.
A heartfelt thank you to our special guests and to the student panelists for their thoughtful engagement. On behalf of our sponsor, the Adventist Theological Society, and on behalf of the Life with God team, I would like to also thank our viewers and our listeners for being here. We hope that you have learned some new and helpful insights that will transform you more into the likeness of God and empower you to become a better human being. As you can see, these conversations bring together young adults and scholars who have dedicated their lives to advancing our understanding of God, of the Bible, and of the complex human personhood. It is a unique opportunity for you to get to know these committed servant leaders and learn from them as they interact with students from around the world. If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so with your presence, your comments, your prayers, and by sharing the program. If you're so inclined, you can also extend your financial support by donating to the Adventist Theological Society. To do so, go to www.atsjats.org/resources and find the Donate Now button. Make sure you also subscribe to the Adventist Theological Society YouTube channel, where you will find past and ongoing seasons. Thank you again, and I hope that you will join us next time as well.